The chemical sting of industrial bleach was the last scent of her shift, a smell Alara had come to associate with bone-deep exhaustion. It clung to the damp fabric of her light blue scrubs as she pushed the heavy mop across the waiting room floor, the rubber soles of her clogs squeaking a miserable rhythm against the linoleum. It was 3 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed a weary, buzzing tune, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with her every movement. Her supervisor, Carol, had made it a point of pride to find extra duties for Alara. "The rookie needs to learn her place," she'd said, her voice thin and sharp, just loud enough for the other nurses at the station to hear. And so, while everyone else signed out, Alara was left to contend with the grime left by a day's worth of fear and desperation.
She didn't complain.
Complaining was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor she had spent the last 5 years carefully constructing. Her body ached, a deep, resonant throb in her lower back and the arches of her feet. She was a big woman, built solid and strong, but the 12-hour shifts followed by Carol's special assignments were starting to wear her down. She finished the last section of the floor, the water in the bucket a murky gray. With a sigh that felt like it came from the very center of the earth, she propped the mop against the wall and sank into one of the hard plastic waiting room chairs. Just for a minute, she told herself. Just long enough for the ache in her spine to subside. Her eyelids felt like they were lined with lead. The hum of the lights became a lullaby. She woke to the feeling of being watched. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years, a cold prickle at the nape of her neck that belonged to a different life. Her eyes snapped open. A man stood a few feet away, a statue carved from shadows and stillness. He wasn't a doctor or a patient. He was dressed in a suit of such impeccable tailoring it seemed to absorb the cheap light of the waiting room and refine it. It was charcoal gray, the fabric hinting at a texture far too rich for a hospital at this hour. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him, and on his wrist, the face of a Patek Philippe watch caught the light, a silent, expensive star in the gloom. He was Korean, his features sharp and angular, as if cut from obsidian. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, so dark they seemed to have no bottom, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving, predatory focus. He hadn't made a sound, yet his presence filled the entire room, pressing in on her, a physical weight in the air. That was when she heard it, the controlled chaos spilling from the emergency bay doors down the hall. Shouted medical terms, the frantic squeal of gurney wheels, a sense of panic that was a notch above the usual nightly drama. The man's gaze didn't flicker. "You are a nurse here," he stated. It wasn't a question. Alara pushed herself up, her professional instincts overriding the alarm bells screaming in her head.
"Yes."
"What's going on?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the commotion. "My associate requires medical attention." The word associate hung in the air, cold and clinical. As she moved toward the bay, the man fell into step just behind her, a silent, menacing shadow. The scene in the trauma room was frantic. A man lay on the gurney, his white shirt stained a terrifying, blossoming red. Dr. Evans was shouting for a line, but the senior nurse, flustered, couldn't find a vein. The patient's blood pressure was crashing. "His veins are collapsing," the nurse cried, her hands shaking. Alara saw it in an instant. The faint blue line on the back of his hand, a difficult, rolling vein most would miss. Without thinking, without asking permission, she moved. She elbowed past the fumbling nurse, grabbed a catheter from the tray, and with a calm, fluid motion that felt like muscle memory from another lifetime, she slid the needle in. A perfect insertion. Blood flashed in the chamber. She secured the line and connected the 4 bag before anyone could protest. Dr. Evans stared at her for a half-second, then barked, "Good. Get another one in his form."
"Now."
She worked, her movements economical and sure. In the periphery, she was aware of the man in the suit. He stood just inside the doorway, a sentinel of absolute calm in the storm. He wasn't watching the doctors or the machines. He was watching her. He watched the way her hands moved, steady and certain. He watched the way her eyes scanned the monitors, assessing, calculating. He saw no panic in her. He saw a deep, settled confidence that was at odds with the rookie tag on her ID badge. The patient was stabilized and rushed toward the operating room. As they wheeled him out, his eyes, glazed with pain, found Alara's. He then looked past her to the man in the suit and whispered a single, strained word in Korean. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a new level of intensity locking onto her. The adrenaline faded, leaving Alara feeling hollowed out. She cleaned herself up, her mind a blank slate. The exhaustion returned with a vengeance, heavier than before. She found herself back in the empty waiting room, the newly cleaned floor gleaming under the harsh lights. She sank into the same chair, the silence of the hospital pressing down. She must have drifted off again because the next thing she knew, he was there. The man in the suit. He was sitting in the chair opposite her, his long legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees. The space between them felt charged, the air thick with unspoken things. "They tell me you are new," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that seemed to cut right through the sterile air. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a slow, heavy beat. "I am." "You do not work like a new nurse," he observed. He leaned forward slightly, the faint scent of expensive cologne, oud and something like cold smoke, reaching her. "My lieutenant, Mr. Park, is alive because of you. He said you have the eyes of a ghost. Someone who has seen this world before and wishes to forget." The floor dropped out from under her. That cold, familiar dread she had run so far to escape washed over her. He knew, or he suspected. And in his world, suspicion was a death sentence. Her carefully constructed anonymity was shattering like glass. She had made a mistake. She had acted instead of hiding. She had saved a man's life, and in doing so, she may have just ended her own. He rose from his chair, a towering, elegant silhouette. "Mr. Park will require private care during his recovery. You will be his nurse." "It is not a request." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. Alara was left alone in the humming silence, the scent of his cologne clinging to the air like a promise and a threat. She had run from the monsters, and one had just found her mopping a floor. The next morning, Carol was waiting for her, her face a mask of pinched fury and confusion. Someone from the board called. "You're being reassigned." Effective immediately, she practically spat the words. "Top floor. VIP suite." "Don't think this means you're special." But Alara knew it did. Special, in this context, meant owned. The VIP suite was less a hospital room and more a luxury hotel. Plush carpets muffled every sound, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline. Kwon Jin-woo's lieutenant, Park, lay in a state-of-the-art bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped in soft, unobtrusive tones. Two of Jin-woo's men, both dressed in dark, simple suits, stood guard outside the door, their faces impassive. They didn't acknowledge her beyond a slight nod. She was a tool, a function. Jin-woo himself was there, standing by the window, his back to the room. He was speaking quietly on his phone in Korean, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. He didn't turn when she entered, but she felt his awareness of her as a physical presence. "Your only duty is to him," he said, ending his call and turning to face her. His gaze swept over her, clinical and assessing. "You will report his condition directly to me. You'll speak to no one else about what you see or hear in this room. Is that understood?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. She would not show him fear. Fear was blood in the water. The days bled into a strange, suspended reality. Alara fell into a routine dictated by Park's needs and Jin-woo's silent, commanding presence. He was a constant fixture, either in the room, watching her work with that unnerving stillness, or just outside, his influence a palpable force field. She learned to move around him, to exist in his orbit without touching it. She was professional, efficient, and distant. She charted Park's vitals, changed his dressings, and administered his medication with a focused calm that gave nothing away. She learned things about Jin-woo in the silence. The way he held his teacup, with his fingers curled just so, a gesture of precise, controlled grace. The faint, silver scar that traced the edge of his left temple, almost hidden by his perfectly cut black hair. The way his focus never wavered when he was looking at something or someone. He wasn't just looking, he was dissecting, analyzing, consuming. One afternoon, while Park was sleeping, she noticed a small, framed photograph on his bedside table that had been placed there overnight. It showed a younger Park standing next to a woman with a brilliant, unguarded smile. Her arm was linked through his, and she was laughing, her head tilted back. Jin-woo stood slightly behind them, a rare, soft expression on his face. A ghost of a smile. Later that evening, Park woke from a morphine-induced haze. His eyes, unfocused, landed on Alara as she adjusted his pillows. "Hannah," he rasped, his voice thick with pain and memory. "You came. I knew you would." The name struck Alara like a physical blow.
Hannah.
He blinked, and the recognition faded, replaced by confusion. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. "Sorry," he mumbled. You have her eyes." He drifted back to sleep. That night, Alara couldn't rest. The name echoed in her mind.
Hannah.
Using the encrypted browser on her burner phone, she searched. It didn't take long to find. Kwon Hannah, a brilliant, rising businesswoman, head of her own successful tech firm, murdered 5 years ago. An official police report called it a carjacking gone wrong. The underworld whispers, the ones that never made the papers, called it a message. A rival family, striking at the one thing the untouchable Kwon Jin-woo loved. His older sister. The case was never solved. That was his wound. The woman he had failed to protect. It explained the cold emptiness in his eyes, the absolute control he exerted over his world. It was the frantic, desperate attempt to ensure nothing like that could ever happen again. And looking at that picture, at the ghost of a smile on his face, she understood that the man who had existed before her death had died with her. All that was left was this cold, lethal shell. The danger, when it came, was silent and swift. It was late, past midnight. The guards outside the door had just changed shifts. Alara was recording Park's fluid output when she heard it, a soft thud from the hallway, followed by a silence that was too complete. Her entire body went rigid. Her past screamed at her. This was wrong. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. Nothing. She eased it open a crack. The 2 guards were on the floor, their bodies still. In their place stood 2 men dressed as hospital orderlies, their faces grim, silenced pistols in their hands. Her heart didn't race. It turned to a block of ice in her chest. Thought and action became one. She slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, her hands moving with a speed that surprised even herself. She spun around, her eyes darting across the room, assessing. Park was groggy, vulnerable. The window was a sheer drop. The only way out was the door. She grabbed the heavy, rolling oxygen tank and shoved it, metal screeching against the floor, to barricade the door. The men outside started ramming their shoulders against it. The wood groaned. What's happening?" Park mumbled, trying to sit up. "Stay down," Alara commanded, her voice low and firm. She hit the silent alarm button by his bed, praying Jin-woo's security was as good as he thought it was. Then she grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a solid glass water pitcher, and stood to the side of the door, her breath held tight in her lungs. The door splintered, then burst open. The first man stumbled in, his gun raised. Alara swung the pitcher with all her strength, the glass connecting with the side of his head with a sickening crunch. He went down in a heap. The second man raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the hallway erupted in a series of muffled shots. Jin-woo's men had arrived. It was over in seconds. Jin-woo himself swept into the room, his own weapon in his hand, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. He took in the scene, the barricade, the downed assassin at Alara's feet, her standing there, breathing heavily, the broken pitcher still in her hand. His gaze moved from the carnage to her, and for the first time, she saw something other than calculation in his eyes. It was a flicker of raw, unguarded shock. The next day, he summoned her to the small sitting area of the suite. The mess had been cleaned, the door replaced. It was as if nothing had happened. A black duffel bag sat on the table between them. "This is for you," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He unzipped the bag. It was filled with neat stacks of cash. "There is also a passport and a plane ticket to anywhere you want to go. My organization will ensure your safe passage out of the country. You will be given a new identity. You can disappear." It was an out. A clean break. The life she claimed she wanted. Anonymity. Safety. All she had to do was take it and walk away. She looked from the money to the other room, where Park was resting, safe. She looked at Jin-woo, at the cold, impenetrable fortress he had built around himself. Leaving was the smart choice. The sane choice.
"No," she said.
His eyes narrowed. "You would be wise to reconsider." "I'm a nurse," she said, the words feeling both true and like a profound lie. "I finished my work. Mr. Park isn't fully recovered." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. She wasn't staying for Park. She was staying for a reason she couldn't yet name, a magnetic pull toward the very danger she had tried to escape. She was staying because for the first time in years, she felt awake. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Then he slowly zipped the bag closed. "As you wish." Later, he was examining the new security measures, checking the locks on the reinforced door himself. Alara was cleaning a small cut on his hand he'd gotten in the aftermath of the attack. Her fingers were gentle, but firm as she applied the antiseptic. He flinched, not from pain, but from the contact. He stilled her hand, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. His touch was cool, his grip surprisingly strong. He turned her hand over, his thumbs stroking the soft skin of her palm, his eyes locked on hers. He could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of her pulse against his fingertips. There was no tremor, no sign of fear. Only a calm, defiant strength. "You are not like them," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost a thought. "The people in my world. They fear death. You seem to have already made your peace with it." He released her as abruptly as he had taken her hand. But the fleeting warmth of his touch lingered on her skin, a brand she could feel long after he had walked away. That was the moment everything changed. The line between patient and nurse, captive and captor, had blurred into something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The internal investigation was swift and brutal. Jin-woo discovered the traitor was one of his own captains, a man named Choi, who had been selling information to a rival faction led by a man named Kong. The betrayal cut deep, leaving a chill in its wake that even Alara could feel. The organization's loyalty, once absolute, now seemed fractured. Jin-woo became even more of a shadow, his silences longer, the coldness in his eyes more pronounced. He arranged to move Park to a more secure private facility. Alara was to go with them. She found herself in the back of a black armored sedan, the city lights a blur through the tinted windows. Jin-woo sat opposite her, his face unreadable in the dim light. The air was thick with tension. The ambush was perfectly executed. A sanitation truck blocked the road, and before their driver could react, 2 black SUVs boxed them in. The world exploded into a cacophony of screeching tires and shattering glass. Bullets hammered against the armored plating of the car like angry fists. Jin-woo moved in a single, fluid motion. He threw himself across the small space, covering Alara with his own body as the back window imploded, spraying them with tempered glass. His weight was heavy, solid, and for a terrifying second, all she could smell was his cologne and the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear. The firefight was short and violent. Jin-woo's men were efficient, but they were outnumbered. A bullet pierced the chassis of the car, tearing through the seat and into Jin-woo's side. He grunted, a sharp intake of breath, but his body remained a shield over hers. She felt the wet warmth spreading through his suit jacket, soaking into her scrubs. When a fragile silence finally fell, he pushed himself off her. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. "We have to move." Now, he ordered, his voice strained. Outside, the scene was carnage. 2 of his men were down. As they scrambled from the wrecked sedan, using it for cover, Alara saw one of Kang's men, injured but alive, raising a pistol from the ground, aiming it squarely at Jinwoo's back. There was no time to shout, no time to think. Adrenaline and instinct took over. Alara lunged for a heavy metal toolkit that had spilled from the trunk of one of the SUVs. She grabbed the largest wrench she could find, its weight solid and real in her hand. With a guttural cry, she brought it down on the man's arm, the crunch of bones sickeningly loud in the sudden quiet. He screamed and dropped the gun. She stood over him, breathing hard, the wrench still clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. Jinwoo stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something she couldn't decipher. The nurse had vanished. In her place was a woman who knew violence, a woman who had just crossed a line she could never uncross. They made it to one of his penthouse safe houses, a sterile, minimalist apartment overlooking the Han River of Koreatown. The city glittered below, oblivious. She pushed him onto the leather sofa, tearing open his shirt to get to the wound. It was a through and through, but he was losing blood. "Get me a medical kit," she ordered one of his men. "And whiskey. And boiling water." Now they moved to obey without question. Her authority was absolute. She worked under the stark light of a modern floor lamp, her hands steady as she cleaned and stitched the wound. The city was silent around them. It was just the 2 of them, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. He never took his eyes off her face. "You should have run," he said, his voice raspy. "You be dead," she replied, not looking up from her task of pulling a suture tight. "That is not your burden to carry." She tied off the final stitch, her movements clean and precise. She finally lifted her head and met his gaze. The guard she kept around herself was gone, stripped away by the violence of the night. "I told myself I was staying to finish a job," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "That I was just being a good nurse. I was lying to myself. It was a confession, raw and honest. It wasn't about love or affection. It was an admission that she belonged in his world far more than she had ever belonged in the one she'd tried to build." He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was surprisingly soft. "Who are you, Alara?" he asked, the first time he had ever used her name. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed. He listened, his expression hardening into stone. When he hung up, the brief moment of intimacy was gone, replaced by icy fury.
"Kong," he said.
"He couldn't get to me. So he went after you." He turned the phone around. It was a news article from an underground source, a blog that trafficked in syndicate gossip. It featured a grainy photo of her, next to one of a man with a fearsome reputation. Her father, an enforcer for a rival family on the East Coast, a man who had vanished years ago. The article painted her as a sleeper agent, a plant sent to infiltrate and destroy the Kwan Empire from within. Kong hadn't just put her in danger. He had made her a liability. He had turned Jinwoo's own organization against her. The pressure on Jinwoo was immense. His advisors, his captains, they all saw Alara as a threat that needed to be neutralized. To them, her actions in the ambush weren't loyalty. They were the calculated moves of a trained operative. Kong, smelling blood, proposed a meeting to negotiate a truce. It was a transparent trap, designed to force Jinwoo's hand. He was expected to walk in alone, having already dealt with his traitor. But Alara was not a pawn. Her father had taught her more than just how to survive a fight. He had taught her the rules of their world, the intricate web of honor, debt, and tradition that governed the syndicates. Kong had broken a cardinal rule by targeting a non-combatant to settle a score. And she knew just who to tell. She used her burner phone to make one call, a call to a number she hadn't dialed in 7 years. She spoke to an old man, the retired head of a neutral Chicago family, a man who owed her father a debt of blood. She didn't ask for an army. She didn't ask for protection. She simply laid out the facts of Kang's transgression, providing irrefutable proof. She invoked her father's name and the debt owed. Then she hung up. She had just changed the game board. The meeting was set for a private room in a high-end restaurant in the heart of the city. When Jinwoo's car pulled up, he was prepared for a confrontation. But he was not prepared for what he saw. Alara was already there, waiting for him at the entrance. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress she must have had one of his men procure. She looked regal, powerful, and completely calm. "They're waiting," she said, as if this were a simple dinner engagement. Inside, Kong was seated at a large table, his men behind him, his face smug. His smile faltered when he saw Alara walk in beside Jinwoo. It vanished entirely when he saw the old man from Chicago, a legend in their world, seated at the head of the table. He had come not as an ally of Jinwoo, but as a judge. "You broke the code, Kong," the old man said, his voice like gravel. The power in the room shifted instantly. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a tribunal. Kong, realizing he was trapped, made a desperate move. His men drew their weapons. But Jinwoo's soldiers, positioned perfectly, were faster. The violence was surgical and absolute. In the chaos, Alara didn't cower. She pointed to a service corridor she'd noted on her way in, a tactical advantage, a blind spot for Kang's men. Her mind was working in concert with his, a seamless, unspoken partnership. When the silence returned, Kong and his faction were permanently neutralized. Jinwoo stood among the wreckage untouched. His men looked at Alara not with suspicion, but with a new, profound respect. She was not a liability. She was an asset. A queen. In the car, the city lights streaked past the windows, painting the plush interior in strokes of neon and gold. The adrenaline of the fight ebbed away, leaving a quiet, humming intensity in its place. Jinwoo turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face in the intermittent light. The war was over.
For now.
"My father once told me that loyalty is a weapon you must forge in fire," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual cold command. "He never told me it could feel like coming home. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was more. It was an acknowledgement, a testament to the fact that she, this woman who had drifted into his life on the fumes of exhaustion and bleach, had become his anchor in a world of violence and betrayal. The cost of this victory was her old life. The dream of being just Alara, the anonymous nurse, was a ghost, a story she used to tell herself. She had chosen this world, and it had claimed her completely. His world, too, had shifted on its axis. In her, he had found a strength he didn't know he was missing, but also a vulnerability his enemies would forever seek to exploit. They didn't speak for the rest of the ride. When they reached his penthouse, he led her not to the living room, but out onto the sprawling balcony. The city lay before them, a glittering, electric ocean. The wind was cool against her skin. She stood beside him, a partner, not a prize. An equal. She placed her hand on the cold glass of the railing, looking out at the empire he commanded. He moved to stand behind her, not touching, just a warm, solid presence. Then he covered her hand with his. It was not a gesture of fleeting passion, but of permanent possession. A silent, irrevocable claim. The city was his kingdom, and he had just crowned his queen. A truth that echoed in the charged silence, as vast and brilliant as the city lights below.